world's largest passenger liner, Titanic, steams through the mid-Atlantic to America. Over 2,200 people are aboard.
Iceberg, right ahead!
Then, disaster strikes.
Faster!
She fills rapidly with water and sinks into the icy ocean. Over 1,500 people are left to drown. But why did so many die? Was it human error or design flaw? Now, using state-of-the-art forensic analysis and a groundbreaking experiment, we reveal a hidden weakness in the most famous ship in history. Disasters don't just happen. They're a chain of critical events. Unravel the clues and count down those final seconds from disaster. Europe, France, Cherbourg, April 10th, 1912. It's the golden age of the ocean liner. In the last 10 years, 368 vessels have entered service on the Atlantic route alone. Mauritania, flagship of the Cunard Line, holds the speed record at 26 knots. But now, a new kind of ship has entered the market. The mighty Titanic. At 269 meters long, nearly 4 times the length of the Boeing 747, she's the largest ship ever built, and is just one of a fleet of 3 new giants. With her sisters, Olympic, and the still-to-be-launched Gigantic, her owners, the White Star Line, hope to achieve a monopoly on the route and drive all competition out of business. She has taken 3 strenuous years to create here in Belfast, Ireland. Put together in exactly the same way as the slightly smaller Olympic, seen in this 1910 film, she's robustly built, ready for a long, hard life in the stormy North Atlantic. 2,000 sheets of immensely strong and flexible steel plate cover the ship's vast frame. 3 million steel and wrought iron rivets hold her together. 8 lives were lost in her construction. She's equipped with the latest safety features, including 15 watertight bulkheads, connected by state-of-the-art, electrically controlled doors. When finally finished, her designers are so confident in the new ship, they equip her with just 20 lifeboats. Only enough for half the passengers and crew aboard. The press, seduced by the hubris, dub her unsinkable. The new ship is capable of 23 knots, not as fast as the Cunard steamers, but no ship on Earth can match her for sheer luxury. For first-class passengers, there's a grand staircase, staterooms, even a Turkish bath. Wealthy newlyweds Mary and Lucian Smith are returning home in style after their honeymoon. Mary, pictured here in 1911, is the daughter of an influential congressman. She's a few weeks pregnant and keen to get back to her folks.
I had such a lovely honeymoon in Europe, but I missed my family and friends, so Lucian booked us for passage back to New York.
Lucian is from Virginia and the son of an industrialist. They paid £60 for a first-class cabin, equivalent to almost £4,000 today. But like a modern airliner, much of the profit comes from carrying large numbers of people at more reasonable prices. On this her maiden voyage, Titanic is just over two-thirds full with 1,343 passengers aboard. The cheapest third-class tickets cost £2 one way, about 2 weeks' wages for an unskilled worker. At the helm of this magnificent machine is the White Star Line's premier captain, Edward Smith. Smith has commanded many White Star maiden voyages, but this journey is to be his last. The 62-year-old veteran of the high seas will retire on his return to England to live with his wife in Hampshire.
Temperature still dropping.
April 13th, 1912, 5 p.m. 3 days into the voyage, and the largest moving object ever created by man is making 21 knots, even though there has been trouble below deck. Hidden deep in the ship's belly, 29 vast boilers generate 46,000 horsepower. 58 men endlessly shovel coal into 159 furnaces. Among them is senior fireman Fred Barrett from Liverpool. He has 10 years' experience in the job, and his expertise is being put to the test. A fire has burned in Coal Bunker W for 12 days. Barrett has been using the smouldering coal to feed the boilers, and the fire is finally out. But part of Bulkhead 5 could have been warped by the heat. Given that the ship cost almost £100 million in today's money, damaging her so soon would be a disaster. April 14th, 1912, 5 p.m. 4 days into the 7-day voyage, it's been decided to have bulkhead number 5 examined for damage on her return to Belfast. In the wireless room, just behind the bridge, operator John Phillips and his assistant Harold Bride work 6-hour shifts. The two men operate the very latest technology, a Marconi 5-kilowatt wireless. Phillips sends and receives wealthy passengers' messages from ship to shore via a relay station approximately 725 kilometers away in Cape Race, Newfoundland, Canada. Phillips has also received 3 incoming reports from ships nearby, all carrying a warning. There's ice ahead. Each message goes to Bride, who takes it to the bridge.
Can you take it to the bridge, please?
Yeah. Excuse me, sir. Something over the wireless for you, sir. Thank you.
Smith has plotted his course with care. In 1912, 2 main transatlantic shipping lanes exist. The northern track is the shortest, but in the colder months, due to the threat of drifting ice, the longer 320-kilometer southern track is used. This winter has been the warmest in 30 years, and more ice has broken off the Arctic shelf than usual. Even the southern track is affected, and Smith amends his course still further south. Having taken this precaution, he decides not to slow down. At her current speed, Titanic should arrive in New York right on schedule. 8:55 p.m. Captain Smith stops at the bridge to check on progress,
Let me know.
Aye, Captain.
then retires to bed. 10 p.m. On the bridge, First Officer Murdoch is now in charge of the ship. His main concern is ice. He knows that at this speed, it can take just over 1.5 kilometers to turn the ship by 45 degrees. Above Murdoch's head, 30 meters up in the crow's nest, lookouts Reginald Lee and Fred Fleet have just started their 2-hour shift. but they work without binoculars. In a mix-up at Southampton, an officer locked them away and left the ship, with the key. Tonight there is no moon, only the stars illuminate the flat, calm sea. 10:55 p.m. In the wireless room, Phillips strains to hear faint messages from Newfoundland when an operator on a nearby ship, SS Californian, begins sending another message. The interruption deafens Phillips. Even though the message is about ice, he fires back an angry response. Get off the frequency. I'm working Cape Race. 11:39 p.m. As Titanic steams ahead, no one realizes that a tiny flaw in the greatest vessel ever built will soon play its deadly part in the death of 15. Titanic, the largest ship ever constructed, steams through the icy North Atlantic at 21.5 knots. In the crow's nest, lookout Fred Fleet spots something in the darkness. At first, he's barely able to make out the dark shape against the horizon. Then, about 450 meters away, a vast iceberg looms out of the night.
Hello?
Iceberg right ahead!
Iceberg right ahead, sir.
Murdoch immediately orders evasive action.
Faster!
Slowly, the Titanic turns to the left. Below decks, crewmen try to cut power to the engines. But stopping Titanic at this speed will take over 800 meters. It's already too late. There's no way to avoid the massive wall of ice.
Faster, man! Faster!
At 11:40 p.m., Titanic glances the iceberg on her starboard side. Ship's fireman Fred Barrett witnesses firsthand the damage caused by the collision.
I was talking with the second engineer. This red light came on, so I shouted out.
Shut down the divers!
Suddenly, water sprays into the hull.
Water came pouring through the ship's side.
In other parts of the ship, passengers hardly notice the collision.
It didn't waken me enough to frighten me. In fact, I just went back to sleep.
But the impact wakes and concerns Captain Smith. 11:48 p.m. Captain Smith hurries through the bowels of the ship. As he looks over a gantry, Smith sees the scale of the damage for the first time. Reports quickly come in that the entire forward section of Titanic is taking on water. In just 10 minutes, the water is 4.5 meters deep. 12 midnight. Smith is back on the bridge. The ship's crew give him shocking news. 5 compartments are flooding. At this rate, Titanic may have as little as 2 hours left. In the boiler room, engineers heroically man the pumps to try and slow the sinking process.
Get it going.
Smith orders the ship's officers to prepare the 20 lifeboats, knowing there are not enough to save everyone aboard.
Keep those lines tight. A little slower on the bow.
If only there were a ship within 2 hours sailing time, it could rescue the remaining 1,500 passengers and crew.
Keep it tight. Keep it tight.
In steerage, ship stewards order sleepy third-class passengers to the lifeboats. Many first-class passengers make their way outside. Most are completely unaware that Titanic has even struck an iceberg. Mary and Lucian Smith are in the crowd.
There was no commotion, no panic. No one seemed particularly frightened.
12:14 a.m. In the wireless room, Captain Smith orders Phillips
Make
to
the
use
call
the
for
wireless
assistance.
to call
I
for
see.
help. He must get someone to come to Titanic's aid. Despite the pumps, water now engulfs the mail room. As time slips away, Captain Smith makes the hardest decision of his life. Abandon ship. He also knows he is expected to go down with his vessel.
Ladies and gentlemen, if we could have women and children only towards the lifeboats,
On
please.
deck,
Please make your way
officers
towards the
immediately load the 20 lifeboats with women and children.
These children do not have life jackets on. Can we get the life jackets on the children, please?
But many refuse to get in, unwilling to leave their husbands behind.
I really must insist.
12:25 a.m. In the wireless room, Philip's desperate efforts finally pay off. Another steamer, SS Carpathia, responds to his call.
Carpathia.
But the ship is 93 kilometers away, and even at top speed, will take almost 4 hours to reach them. Where is the vessel that only 2 hours ago warned them of ice? Surely, she must hear Titanic's plea for help. Titanic is sinking. As she takes on water, second and third class passengers try to find their way up to the lifeboats through the labyrinth of corridors.
Ladies and gentlemen,
Women and children already on deck climb reluctantly into the lifeboats.
women and children only. Thank you.
Then there's a glimmer of hope. An officer spots a ship just 10 kilometers away. Could it be the Californian? If she sees them, she could reach them in less than half an hour. Smith immediately orders a distress message by signal light. 12:40 a.m. In the boiler room, crewmen are working the pumps when a bulkhead gives way without warning. As passengers make their way along the deck, the crew lower the first lifeboat into the water. The lifeboat has a capacity of 65, but leaves with 37 empty seats. Lucian begs Mary to go without him. Below deck, water rushes into the ship. Hundreds of second and third class passengers are lost in the maze of corridors and clamor to get to the lifeboats. In the wireless room, John Phillips and Harold Bride desperately continue to call for rescue, knowing that there's a ship nearby which could reach them faster than the Carpathia. On deck, confusion turns to alarm. Officers loading women and children into the lifeboats have to hold back frightened men. On the bridge, they get no reply from the mystery ship on the horizon. Is it the Californian? Why isn't she responding? They watch forlornly as her lights vanish into the inky black night. 1:30 a.m. 1 hour and 50 minutes after collision, Titanic claims its first victims. 5 clerks, rescuing post from the flooded mailroom, drown. On deck, passengers begin to panic and run for the lifeboats. Lucian Smith forces his pregnant wife through the crowd and onto lifeboat 6.
He kissed me goodbye. And as the boat was being lowered, he told me to keep my hands in my pockets. That it was cold weather. That's the last I saw of him. a.m. The crew lowered the last lifeboats into the water, but over 1,500 passengers and crew are still on board Titanic. As the bow of the ship sinks even deeper into the water, many run in panic to the stern. It's every man and the remaining women and children for themselves. Two hours and 40 minutes after impact, Titanic's power finally fails and the lights go out. Horrified, Mary Smith watches the sea swallow the ship and her loved one. Over 705 survivors drift in the freezing night, not knowing if they'll be saved. At 4:30 a.m., SS Carpathia finally comes to the rescue of the stranded passengers and crew. As the survivors climb from the lifeboats onto the small ship, it quickly becomes evident that there's been a massive loss of life. Among the 1,500 dead are Captain Edward Smith, wireless operator John Phillips, and Mary Smith's husband Lucian, who'll never see his unborn child. In the following weeks, the British and American authorities hold official inquiries, one in London and one in New York. They ask over 41,000 questions, but neither come to a firm conclusion about what caused this terrible tragedy. Nearly a century has passed since the sinking of Titanic, but it still stands as one of the worst shipping disasters of all time. The mystery of what happened that night has captured people's imagination for generations, spawning countless books and films. Today on the internet, 40 million pages can be found on the subject. From claims that the ship was not Titanic but her sister Olympic, to suggestions that dark forces were at work. Finding the truth will require a modern, forensic approach. By using current-day techniques and computer simulations, we'll re-examine the sinking of Titanic and discover that one tiny detail might have saved hundreds of lives. Commander Brian Penoya is an accident investigator with the US Coast Guard. Much of his work is classified, but he's examined nearly 400 marine incidents to date. Even so, he still finds the magnitude of the Titanic disaster shocking.
The scale of the tragedy, the loss of life, are absolutely horrifying.
Now, Commander Panoia will re-examine the case and scrutinize every shred of evidence he can find. He starts at the Library of Congress. Here, hundreds of documents record in vivid detail the horror of the night Titanic sank. There are transcripts of wireless communications, testimonies from passengers and crew, pages of detailed technical records. The early clues to solving the disaster should lie here. But for Panoia, years of experience tell him there must have been a chain of unforeseen events which led to catastrophe.
An accident like this, a disaster of this scale, never results from a single cause. That's kind of an old-fashioned way of looking at things. Instead, there are a number of causes which have to come together at just the right time and just the right place.
Modern investigation protocol demands that Panoia establish the prevailing weather and sea conditions. As he examines the records, Panoia confirms that the ocean was flat calm, there was no wind, and the moon hadn't risen. Next, Panoia checks the ship's course. She was approximately 16 kilometers south of the southern track, the safer of the two most commonly used routes across the Atlantic. However, Panoia finds that floating ice caused by the mild winter that year had been reported by several vessels in the area. One ice report stands out more than the others. A ship called SS Californian had stopped because the conditions were so bad. Her wireless operator, Cyril Evans, broadcast a warning to all ships in the area. In the days before radar, wireless was a vital source of weather information for the captain. But although the message was a warning of ice, Phillips just cut the other man off. Commander Panoia finds it hard to believe.
It's insane. Why would he do that?
Is the sinking of Titanic down to one man? Phillips, the wireless operator. Panoia contacts Morse code expert and Titanic historian Park Stevenson. He uses the 21st century's equivalent of the wireless, the video conference.
I'm working Cape Race.
He asks Stevenson if
Seems
there
quite
is a
peculiar
reason
in view of the
for Phillips'
navigational
actions.
situation.
At the time, Phillips was actually receiving messages that had been waiting for Titanic from Cape Race.
Stevenson explains that as Phillips on Titanic struggled to hear faint messages from Cape Race, 725 kilometers away, Cyril Evans, the operator on the nearby SS Californian, had less sensitive equipment and was unaware that the frequency was busy. As Evans began to send his ice warning to all ships in the area, Phillips was almost deafened by the sudden broadcast.
Because the Californian was so close to the Titanic, Californian signal would have been so loud that it would have blown his eardrums out.
Even so, Phillips' next move appears to be damning. He goes back to passengers' messages without passing the ice warning to the bridge. But Parks, with his comprehensive knowledge of the rules of wireless communication, thinks otherwise.
But if you look at the protocols, the responsibility lies squarely on Evans' shoulders.
In 1912, messages meant for the bridge of another ship had to be prefixed with the letters MSG, meaning Master Servicegram. Evans' message had no such prefix, so Phillips was justified in ignoring it. This is the reason that Evans' warning didn't reach the bridge of Titanic. Instead of resending the message, Evans turned off his wireless and went to bed.
In the end, he failed to deliver the ice warning to Titanic that his captain had ordered him to do.
But even though Evans failed to send this vital ice warning correctly, it's still impossible to blame him for the tragedy. Throughout the day, the ship had received 5 warnings of ice, but the captain decided to steam on at 21.5 knots anyway. Why, after all the warnings, was the Titanic still traveling at normal speed? Now Penoya considers the second major suspect, the captain, Edward Smith. Did Smith make a deadly error and push the ship too fast in the face of danger? The records show that he was an accomplished seaman who'd commanded White Star ships for over 24 years. He'd even captained Titanic's sister ship, Olympic, on her maiden voyage 10 months earlier.
Captain Smith's 40 years of experience made him the first choice to captain all of White Star's new ships on their maiden voyages.
Yet after the disaster, Smith's actions came under intense scrutiny. After all, as commander of the ship, he bore ultimate responsibility for what happened that night. The central allegation is that he was under commercial pressure in the highly competitive transatlantic market, and that he was risking everything to get to America on time. At noon, the crew would post the distance traveled the previous day on a notice board for passengers to look at. On day 1, she covered 621 kilometers. On day 2, 835. On day 3, 878. Not as fast as the Mauritania, but Titanic is nearly half as big again. But despite these indications, Penoya finds hidden in the records a very different reality. Captain Smith had actually been breaking in Titanic gently. 2 of the ship's 29 boilers weren't even lit. Smith wasn't racing recklessly at all. The ship was capable of sailing even faster. Then comes a turning point in Penoya's investigation. As he sifts through the final arguments of the British inquiry, something extraordinary comes to light. Penoya reads that Smith's attitude to ice was in fact quite normal for the day. In 1912, it was common practice to steam into ice fields. Smith wasn't racing to New York, but doing what was considered to be safe.
The idea, I suppose, was that the ship was in danger only so long as it was in the ice field. Therefore, to be safe, get out of the ice field as quickly as you can.
Edwardian captains just put their trust in their ship and their own skill to see them through.
It's really insane. That's like saying, if you wander into a minefield, what you really ought to do is run.
Commander Penoya can't blame Smith, Phillips, or even Evans for the disaster, so he turns his attention to Titanic's last line of defense, the lookouts. Reginald Lee and Fred Fleet had a prime position in the crow's nest and were considered to be the eyes of the ship. So why didn't they see the iceberg until just 37 seconds before impact? Penoya decides a simple low-tech experiment could shed light on their situation. He takes a Coast Guard lifeboat across Lake Chesapeake in Maryland to replicate the conditions the night Titanic sank. The key factors are the speed of the ship and the temperature. At 21.5 knots, The wind chill is -7 degrees Celsius. The men were well wrapped up, but surely their eyes were badly exposed. As the Coast Guard boat races at similar speed, Panoia confirms his suspicions. The freezing air blasts into his eyes, affecting his ability to see.
My eyes are already tearing because of the wind, and it's a bit harder to find the horizon than I thought it would be.
In low light, the human eye sees only black and white, making it hard to pick out blue ice against a black sky. With no waves breaking against the massive object, it's unsurprising Fleet and Lee were compromised. To make things worse, due to a mix-up in Southampton, they had no binoculars. So would binoculars have made a difference? In 1912, optical technology was reasonably advanced. A typical pair would have had a magnification of 4 or 5 times and a field of view of about 4 degrees. So would they have helped the lookouts?
Actually, the binoculars aren't as useful as you might think. Unless you know what you're looking for, you really don't know where to point them, and all you see is a black circle. I don't think they made any difference that night.
In any case, lookouts were trained not to use them to scan the horizon, being told instead to watch with the naked eye and only use binoculars to confirm a sighting. With no evidence that the lookouts were in any way at fault, Commander Panoia makes the only conclusion he can.
It'd be tidy if we could blame a single individual, but the truth is, there's really no one you can point to and say, this fellow is to blame for this accident.
Panoia's attention shifts away from the crew to the ship and the iceberg. Now he needs to work out what happened at the actual moment of collision. This photograph was taken from a ship called CS Minia that visited the scene of the accident a few days later. It's claimed to be of the actual iceberg. Oceanographers calculate that this giant block was drifting south at just over half a kilometer an hour, crossing Titanic's path almost at right angles. As a rule of thumb, 7/8 of an iceberg sit beneath the waterline. Using accounts that the iceberg was 18 meters high, Panoia estimates its weight to be about 270,000 tons, 6 times that of the ship. But the impact should have been survivable. Titanic's 2.5 centimeter thick steel sheeting, held together with 3 million rivets, was not her only defense. Any 4 of her 16 compartments could fill with water at the same time, and the ship would still stay afloat. But clearly, that night, something went wrong. The original investigations concluded that she had been ripped open, causing a 90-meter-long tear, rupturing 5 inner compartments, one more than she could withstand. But this scenario has long been contested. In 1985, explorer Robert Ballard used a Navy research vessel to find the wreck, 3 kilometers down. 10 years later, a team of scientists revisited the site. Using sonar to probe through thick mud, they discovered that she seems to have been pierced by a series of small holes and could find no evidence for a large gash. So was the Titanic split open like a sardine can, or did some other type of damage occur? To get more information, Panoia visits one of the world's leading authorities on Titanic's design, Bill Garsky. He asks if a 90-meter gash in the side of Titanic tallies with a sinking time of 2.5 hours. Garsky says the maths is straightforward. For the ship to sink, she needs to take on about 34,470 tons of water. But with a 90-meter gash, that amount would have flooded in too fast.
That's a big hole, and there is no way that, based upon the fact that it took Titanic 2.5 hours to sink, that there was that kind of damage.
But there is a second intriguing theory that Garsky could shed light on. Heroic fireman Fred Barrett, who survived the sinking, testified that there had been a coal bunker fire by a bulkhead separating compartments 5 and 6. An hour after the impact with the iceberg, this very bulkhead suddenly gave way. Had the bulkhead been weakened by the fire, leading to the flooding of a 5th compartment and the loss of the ship? Garsky thinks not.
It's a good theory, but it doesn't measure up to what we now know happened to the ship.
Garsky explains that because crew were already pumping water out of compartment 5, it must have been breached beforehand.
The ship was beyond hope at that point. It was going to sink.
With the bulkhead theory ruled out, Penoyer considers another explanation. Was the ship built from substandard materials? Might the steel hull plates, chilled to freezing point in the icy water, have been brittle and cracked under impact? Over the years, several samples from the wreck have been recovered, both of the plating and the rivets used to hold it together. Penoyer decides to see if the samples show any weaknesses. At NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, metallurgist Tim Fakey was lucky enough to examine some of the few pieces of hull in 1998.
Appreciate it, man. What I'm wondering is there any problem with the manufacture or the condition of the steel plating on the Titanic?
We've run tests on some Titanic steel ourselves, slow bending in ice water, and it turns out the
Fakey subjected the samples to rigorous mechanical and chemical analysis and scanned the surface of test pieces using electron microscopes. His conclusion was plain. The steel was reasonable quality for the time and was not unusually brittle, even at low temperatures. If there was a flaw in the materials, it must be somewhere else. Between each of Titanic's hull plates was a watertight seam. Holding these seams in place were 3 million 2.5 centimeter diameter rivets, some of which were installed by machine and some by hand. Fakey explains that during construction, builders used a massive riveting machine on most of the hull, installing rivets made from steel. But they were unable to get this huge device into the front section of Titanic's hull, so they had to rivet this section by hand. They used wrought iron rivets instead of steel because they were easier to work by hand. But wrought iron is not as strong as steel, a problem the builders were aware of. To try and compensate for this, they mixed a substance called slag into the molten iron. The slag forms tiny glass-like particles throughout the rivet which can make it stronger. But the mixture of iron and slag is critical. Use too much slag, and the rivets can actually become weaker. A second scientist at NIST, Dr. Jennifer Hooper McCarty, studied the rivets recovered from the salvaged sections of Titanic's hull. She found the rivets in the Titanic might have been compromised.
In a normal case, the slag would help to strengthen it. However, in the Titanic rivets, they were in areas and they were large enough that it quite possibly could have weakened the rivets.
So what that means is these large areas of slag could have led to the rivets failing and could have led to the sinking of the Titanic.
It's possible.
It's a theory that has never been proved. The wrought iron rivets might be the linchpin on which the whole disaster hangs. If they gave way under the impact, water would have poured in through the broken seams, which would explain how a glancing blow sank Titanic. Penoyer decides on a groundbreaking experiment. He will test the theory that weakened rivets could have led to a critical failure of Titanic's hull. He commissions a foundry in North Yorkshire, England, to manufacture a small section of steel hull to the original design. Foundry workers heat each rivet to 600 degrees Celsius, then push them through 2.5 centimeter steel plates to create a lap joint. As the rivets cool, they pull the plates together with tremendous force, creating the watertight seal essential for Titanic's seaworthiness. The replica from England sits in a stress testing machine in Fakey's Maryland laboratory.
And here we go.
He affectionately dubs it the mother of all bench vices. The plan is to mimic the forces exerted on Titanic's hull as she struck the iceberg, to see if the rivets were the key to the disaster. Marine investigator Commander Brian Penoyer and metallurgist Tim Fakey are attempting to simulate the moment the Titanic struck an iceberg. They've placed a section of replica hull in a machine which can mimic the moment of impact.
Yeah, there it goes. You can see the bend starting.
The theory is that as Titanic struck the iceberg, the rivets in her hull failed, which led to seawater flooding into the ship through ruptured seams. Fakey calculates from the speed of the collision and the weights of the ship and the iceberg that each rivet would have been put under at least 14,000 pounds of pressure on impact.
See how these rivets hold up here.
If the replica rivet breaks below 14,000 psi, Penoyer will know rivet failure was the likely cause of the loss of the ship. If not, it's back to square one. At 4,000 pounds of pressure, the steel plate begins to flex. It becomes visible at 5,000 pounds.
You can see the plate is bending at the rivet point.
At 6,000 pounds, the rivet remains intact.
Plates are coming apart just a little bit. I think the rivet's stretching.
7,000 pounds. Will the rivet snap, or will it stretch beyond 14,000 psi?
And it's basically a contest of which one runs out of energy absorption first.
8,000. 9,000.
'Goes.
All right. Beautiful.
The rivet fails at just under 10,000 pounds. The experiment is a success. To be absolutely sure it was rivet failure which caused Titanic's hull to fail, Penoyer revisits metallurgist Jennifer Hooper McCarty to compare his rivets to those salvaged from Titanic.
Okay, so right now we're looking at one of the rivet heads from the tests.
Right.
It's in the microscope here, and we're looking at the surface where it fractured.
As Hooper McCarty examines the rivet from Commander Penoy's experiment under the electron microscope, the slag is clearly visible as dark, crystalline forms within the iron. It's these areas where the weakness in the iron begins. Tiny fractures spread from these weaker areas until the rivet completely fails. Crucially, the genuine Titanic rivets show a very similar pattern.
Now, if we look at what we saw in Titanic, and I have a picture here, we see the same thing. You see a fractured surface where the slag has created a hole where it's cracked, and we start to form a larger hole until the whole head comes up.
There's only one major difference between the two samples. On the Titanic, the rivets were even worse.
The particles were bigger, and they initiated bigger holes, bigger cracks, and it failed more quickly.
So that's a conclusive result.
Totally.
By simulating the moment when the vast ship struck the iceberg, the story of how Titanic sank can now be told. The chain of critical events that took place in those final seconds from disaster. April 14th, 1912. 1 hour and 10 minutes to disaster. Titanic steams west at 21.5 knots. It's a chilly, moonless night. In the crow's nest, eye-watering conditions and low light levels hamper the lookout's ability to see. 45 minutes to disaster. Wireless operator John Phillips receives an ice warning from the nearby SS Californian. The message is wrongly formatted, and Phillips doesn't pass it on to the bridge. 30 seconds to disaster. A huge iceberg looms out of the darkness. At the moment of collision, at least 14,000 pounds of pressure are put on the rivets holding the hull together. They're compromised by too much slag in the wrought iron mix, and they fail. Water pours through the ruptured seams and floods 5 compartments. One too many for the ship to sustain. Phillips is unable to raise the SS Californian, since Evans is now asleep. Even though the Californian is perhaps only 16 kilometers away, she does not come to the rescue. 2.5 hours after a glancing blow with an iceberg, the greatest ship ever built was gone, killing over 1,500 men, women, and children. Important lessons were learned from the tragedy. The US government set up the North Atlantic Ice Patrol to spot for icebergs. And the law both sides of the Atlantic was changed to ensure that every passenger ship carried enough lifeboats. Even so, this disaster lives on. The story of Titanic is famous for many reasons. A brand new ship, a fascinating era, an accident that could have been foreseen, a tragic ending. Ultimately, the incident shows that no matter what humankind think they can achieve, nature should never be underestimated, or people will pay with their lives.
It's impossible to go through the record of the sinking of the Titanic and be unmoved by the human tragedy that occurred. It's just a waste. It was an incredible waste.